it hard to get these guys to talk about, you're talking to, was it hard to get them to be vulnerable?
The surprising thing about Chris, as tough as he was how vulnerable he was and how willing he was to talk about his failings and his weaknesses and his struggle. And interestingly enough, a number of the other enforcers were quite willing to talk about that too. You know, they were quite candid about fear. You'd think, well, these guys weren't afraid. They were terrified. You know, every day somebody like Bob Probert talked about how scared he was before every game. It's something that they live with, and I think they're happy to have the opportunity to really reckon with it and be honest. Now, you know, they're not Oprah-like in the way they express themselves, but still, I think, given how tough they are, they're amazingly forthcoming about their emotions.
Well, how do you address it then? What sorts of conversations do you think we need to be had? Not just about hockey fighting, but just about the way we approach violence in our own lives.
Well, look, I think, too, you know, one thing we have to be terribly careful about, and even the enforcers would say this, is, you know, there's a difference between two people who are more or less equals reckoning with each other in a kind of a sanctioned way. It's another thing when you have people who are terribly more powerful beating on somebody who's relatively helpless. Yeah. It's that abuse of power. Frankly, it's that abuse of power that really burns up people like Chris. That's one of the reasons that he feels he's avenging that. If you're looking for a common thread in some of my films, I've always been interested in the abuse of power and very angry at people who do abuse it.
Yeah, you certainly see it, especially in the war films, right? You get a real sense of that. What did you learn about yourself through this process?
Well, one thing I learned about myself on this film was that I have a certain character trait in common with Chris, which is not necessarily one which guarantees your success, and that is that, you know, a lot of people, they say, who are successful suck up and kick down. I think I've had a tendency, as Chris has, to suck down and kick up, which is not always a great recipe for success.
That could be troubling, couldn't it?
Yes, it is.
Do you think some of this in you is because of your old man and what he did for a living? He was a journalist, right?
He was a journalist, and, you know, he was a truth seeker in that sense, and I think, you know, that's something, and I think he was always curious to the end of his days. You know, that's something I model myself on, too, the idea that as you get older, you don't turn off, you don't settle in your views, you try to keep expanding your horizons and to become increasingly curious. That's a tough thing to do because you tend to get set in your ways, but if you can apply that, if you can apply that discipline and exercise that muscle, I think it's a good thing.